Jason Miller's life had always been ordinary, the kind of life that moved quietly between morning coffee and night shifts. He worked at Walmart in a small Arkansas town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. He was dependable, kind, and never late. His wife, Claire, was his center, the person he believed made all the long hours worth it. They had been married for 7 years, and though the spark had dimmed, Jason still believed that love, like hard work, only needed patience. On a rainy Tuesday, he arrived early for his shift. The rain came down hard, tapping against the store's metal roof as he walked through the employee entrance. He wanted to get ahead on the unloading schedule, maybe surprise the team. The back room was dim and quiet, filled with the smell of cardboard and detergent. Jason moved between shelves, humming softly, his mind somewhere between exhaustion and habit. Then he turned a corner, and froze. Under the flickering fluorescent light, he saw Claire. She wasn't supposed to be there. And she wasn't alone. Rick, his coworker, the man who'd worked beside him for 3 years, was with her. The sight didn't need explanation. There were no words, no confusion, just the heavy truth that dropped into his chest like a stone. For a long moment, Jason couldn't breathe. The world around him blurred, the sound of the rain grew louder, and he felt his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He dropped the box he was carrying. The crash of metal and glass shattered the silence, and Claire turned, her face pale and terrified. Jason didn't speak. He didn't move. Something inside him felt like it was breaking apart, but not in anger, more like a thread snapping after years of being stretched too thin. He turned away, every step heavy, every breath shallow. Behind him, muffled voices rose, but he didn't listen. The smell of propane lingered in the air, faint but sharp, leaking from the tank he had reported broken weeks ago. He walked toward the door, his vision foggy from tears and smoke. A second later, a sound like thunder ripped through the air. The explosion shook the floor, throwing Jason to the ground outside the back exit. Flames burst upward, painting the rain orange and black. Alarms screamed. He could hear people shouting, sirens in the distance, the world spinning into chaos. When firefighters arrived, they pulled Jason from the mud. He was shaking, covered in soot, staring blankly at the burning building. Inside, they found 2 bodies, Claire and Rick, lost to the flames before anyone could reach them. Investigators called it an accident, a tragedy caused by a faulty tank. Jason never argued. He simply quit his job, packed what little he owned, and vanished. Years later, stories spread about a man who lived deep in the mountains, quiet and alone, who had walked through fire and somehow kept walking. Some said he was broken. Others said he was reborn. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, surrounded by pines that whispered with every gust of wind. Jason built it himself, piece by piece, from salvaged wood and stone. It wasn't much, a single room with a cot, a stove, and shelves filled with canned food and notebooks. But it was enough. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up to alarms or fluorescent lights. He woke up to the sound of birds and the slow rhythm of rain on the roof. The silence that used to terrify him became his companion. In that stillness, he began to face the ghosts he had tried to escape. Every morning, he hiked through the woods, learning the language of the land, the sound of a creek changing with the season, the smell of pine after a storm. He found comfort in small things, the way sunlight filtered through the trees, the crackle of firewood, the scratch of a pen across paper. He started writing, not about the fire, or about Claire, or about Rick, but about survival, forgiveness, and what it meant to start over when you no longer trusted yourself. For months, he barely spoke to another soul. The nearest town was miles away, and the people there only knew him as the quiet man who bought supplies twice a month. They never asked about his past, and he never offered it. Time moved differently in the mountains. Days blurred into one another, and seasons slipped quietly by. The first winter was the hardest. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and loneliness crept in like the cold. But Jason endured. He chopped wood until his hands bled, kept the fire burning, and wrote until sleep pulled him under. Pain, he realized, didn't vanish with distance. It just changed shape. The memories of that night returned in fragments, a crash, a flame, a scream swallowed by smoke. He didn't know if the fire had been fate or punishment, but he began to see it as a line drawn between two lives, the man he had been, and the man he was becoming. By spring, something inside him started to shift. The grief didn't leave, but it softened, like ice melting into a stream. He began to see beauty again, not in people, but in the world itself. He fed stray animals that wandered near his cabin and built bird feeders from scrap wood. Nature became his teacher. From the trees, he learned patience. From the storms, resilience. From the endless silence, acceptance. One morning, standing by the river, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not joy, not forgiveness, just the quiet understanding that he had survived. Jason stayed in the mountains for nearly a decade. His beard grew gray, his hands rough, his eyes calm. The man who had once been consumed by betrayal had turned into someone unrecognizable, someone who had learned that losing everything doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes, it's the only way to begin again. When Jason finally returned to civilization, the world felt louder than he remembered. The roads buzzed with restless energy, and the faces of strangers carried a kind of hurried emptiness. He had spent so long listening only to the sound of wind and fire that human noise felt foreign. He didn't return for anyone in particular, he returned because he felt ready. There was no plan, no destination, only a quiet pull that told him his time in isolation had served its purpose. He drove an old truck that coughed and rattled the whole way down from the mountains. It had been years since he'd seen a city, and as the skyline came into view, memories flickered like static: his old life, the store, the fire. He didn't push them away this time. They were part of him, but they no longer defined him. He settled in a small town just outside Little Rock, renting a modest apartment above a diner. The first few weeks were strange. He watched people come and go, couples arguing in parking lots, children laughing on sidewalks, workers staring blankly at their phones. It all reminded him of the life he'd once lived, busy, predictable, and fragile. Yet, instead of bitterness, he felt empathy. He saw pain in others the way he once carried his own, and for the first time, he wanted to help. One afternoon, he walked into a community center after seeing a sign that read "Volunteers Needed." He didn't know what he could offer, but he stayed anyway. They gave him simple tasks at first: sorting donations, stacking chairs, fixing shelves. It wasn't long before someone noticed his quiet steadiness, the way he never complained, the calm that seemed to follow him. People started asking questions. Where had he learned to work like that? What had he done before? Jason never gave details. He simply said he'd spent time learning how to start over. That answer intrigued people more than any story would have. Soon, they asked him to speak to a group of struggling individuals, people who'd lost jobs, families, or hope. Jason hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. Standing in front of a dozen tired faces, he told them about failure, loss, and finding purpose again. He didn't name names or describe the tragedy, but his words carried the weight of truth. He spoke slowly, with the same tone the mountains had taught him: steady, grounded, unafraid of silence. When he finished, no one clapped, but the room was still. Something had shifted. After that day, people began inviting him to speak elsewhere: schools, shelters, small gatherings. He didn't see himself as a teacher or a preacher, but his story traveled quietly from one person to another. Those who heard it didn't remember the details, they remembered how it made them feel, that broken things could still have worth, that loss could become strength. For Jason, every word was a promise to himself, that he would never let pain be the only thing his life stood for. As the years passed, Jason's name began to circulate beyond the small towns he spoke in. People referred to him as the man who walked through fire and came back whole. He never corrected them, though the phrase made him uneasy. He wasn't whole, not really. He had scars that didn't show, memories that still woke him at night, and moments where the smell of smoke could send him spiraling back to that awful evening. But he had learned to live with it, to carry the pain without letting it control him. That, he often told others, was what healing really meant. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about continuing to move forward even when the weight of the past pressed against your chest. Jason began writing again, filling notebooks with reflections about endurance and forgiveness. His words weren't poetic or polished, but they were honest, and that honesty drew people in. A local publisher discovered one of his talks online and offered to compile his writings into a small book. He refused at first, not wanting attention, but eventually agreed when he realized that sharing his story could reach people he'd never meet. The book was called The Fire I Survived, and though it sold modestly, it found its way into hospitals, recovery centers, and libraries across the state. Letters began arriving at his door from strangers who saw pieces of themselves in his story, people who had lost spouses, homes, or entire lives and had thought they would never stand again. Each message reminded him why he had returned to the world in the first place. He spent his weekends traveling, speaking at community events and prisons, always keeping his message simple. Pain, he said, was not an enemy. It was a teacher. And the lesson was not about how to avoid it, but how to rise when it found you. People listened because he didn't speak like a man who had read about hardship, he spoke like someone who had lived in its shadow and found light anyway. Those who met him described his presence as quiet but unshakable, like standing near something ancient and grounded. One winter, he returned to the Walmart in his old town for the first time. It had been rebuilt long ago, larger and brighter, with no trace of the tragedy that had happened there. He stood in the parking lot, watching the automatic doors slide open and close, letting the past wash over him. There was no anger left, no sadness, only a strange sense of gratitude. That night had destroyed one life but made room for another. Before leaving, he walked to the back of the store, behind the loading dock where the fire had begun. The air was cold, and the asphalt glistened under the streetlights. Jason stood there for a while, then smiled faintly. What once marked the end of everything had become the foundation of who he was. The fire hadn't taken his life. It had forged it. By the time Jason turned 50, his story had spread far beyond Arkansas. Videos of his talks appeared online, shared by people who found strength in his quiet determination. He never sought fame, yet somehow it found him. Reporters reached out, churches invited him to speak, and television hosts asked for interviews, but Jason remained selective. He chose the places that felt real, the shelters, the youth centers, the small-town auditoriums with flickering lights and folding chairs. That was where he felt most connected. He never spoke about the affair or the fire directly, never named the people involved, because for him, it was never about revenge or tragedy. It was about transformation. He told audiences that the worst pain a person could feel might one day become their greatest strength, if they allowed it to teach rather than destroy. He began mentoring others who had gone through similar loss. There was a veteran who had lost his family in a car crash, a woman rebuilding her life after years of addiction, a teenager who had watched his parents walk away. Jason listened to them the way no one had listened to him years ago, without judgment, without rushing them toward hope. He taught them that healing was not a straight path but a slow climb, full of slips and pauses. Some of them stayed in touch, writing him letters about the lives they were rebuilding. Others drifted away, but Jason never forgot their faces. He carried them with him wherever he went, reminders that purpose could grow out of ruin. Eventually, he returned to the mountains where his second life had begun. The cabin still stood, though the wood had aged and the roof sagged in places. He repaired it quietly, not to live there again but to preserve the memory of the man who had once hidden from the world. In the evenings, he sat by the river, watching the reflection of the setting sun ripple across the water. He no longer feared the past, he simply acknowledged it as part of his story. The grief, the fire, the years of silence, all of it had shaped the calm that now defined him. Near the end of his life, Jason wrote a final letter to no one in particular. In it, he said that every person walks through some form of fire. Some are consumed by it, others emerge changed. What matters most is not what is lost, but what is found afterward: courage, faith, understanding, or peace. He ended the letter with a single line: "I walked into the flames as one man and walked out as another." When he passed away a few months later, the letter was found beside his journal, and a small memorial was held in the town he once called home. People from across the state came to honor him, not as a man defined by tragedy, but as proof that even from the ashes, something beautiful can still rise.